Montana Territory, July 1887. A merchant swept a woman's pendant off the counter and smiled at the crowd. "We don't serve beggars." She knelt slowly, deliberately, picked it up off the dusty floor, and said nothing. Then boots crossed the room, heavy, unhurried. A tall stranger stepped out of the shadows and put $2 silver on the counter, like a man dropping a sentence he was done arguing about. A woman trading honest labor for food carries more dignity than a man selling insults from behind a counter. His jaw was set. His eyes gave nothing away, and he walked out like he hadn't just changed everything. She had 8 cents, a law book, and nowhere to go. He had a locked room, a buried grief, and a ranch that someone powerful was coming to take. Neither of them knew yet what the other one was about to cost them. If you want to know what happens when two people who've lost everything refuse to lose each other, this story is for you. Let's begin. The stagecoach hit Oak Haven, like a freight train that had forgotten how to stop. It came barreling down the main road in a wall of red dust, horses lathered white along their necks, iron wheels screaming against packed earth. The driver hauled back hard on the reins, and the whole rig shuddered and swayed before it groaned to a halt outside the relay station. Dust drifted over the town in a slow red curtain and then settled back down, quiet and patient. July 1887. Montana Territory. Heat so heavy, you could feel it pressing down on your shoulders. Hannah Thorne climbed down from the coach on her own. Nobody offered a hand, and she wasn't waiting for one. She landed in the dirt, straightened her spine, and looked at Oak Haven for the first time. 300 souls, maybe, if you were counting generously. Wooden storefronts bleached pale by the sun. A water trough with a hairline crack along its base. A dog asleep in the shadow of a hitching post, entirely unbothered by her arrival. She had expected someone from the Harlow homestead to be there waiting. Nobody was. A broken axle outside Billings had seen to that. 2 days stranded in open country while a replacement spoke was hauled in from a depot somewhere east of nowhere. 2 days was long enough for a promised job to go cold. She knew that before she even opened her mouth to ask. But she asked anyway. The man sweeping sawdust off a hardware porch didn't bother to look up. "Harlow's sold out and left in the spring," he said. "March, I think. Or April." Hannah thanked him and kept walking, 8 cents in her coin purse. Her father's copy of the Montana Territorial Land Law tucked into her suitcase, its spine mended twice with paste, and linen strips, its margins crowded with penciled notes from a man who'd died still believing the law could protect ordinary people. A raw quartz pendant on a thin silver chain around her neck, her mother's, the stone pale and unpolished and rough at the edges. A battered suitcase that had survived 2 rail lines and a coach ride across half a territory. No job. She kept her chin level and kept moving. There'd been a time when losing a position wouldn't have rattled her. Before her father's practice collapsed. Before the engagement ended quietly. Without drama, but with the particular cruelty of a man who found poverty inconvenient. She had stopped letting herself think about that. What she had left was her father's books and her mother's pendant, and the practical knowledge of how to work hard and survive on very little. That would have to be enough. Higgins's general store sat at the far end of Main Street, squeezed between a saddle shop and a land office. The sign above the door was the freshest-looking thing on the whole block. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, pine soap, and cured meat. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, stirring the heat without reducing it. A few men talked quietly near the back wall, debating feed prices. A woman in faded calico sorted through a flour bin near the window. Obadiah Higgins stood behind the counter on a low wooden platform he'd clearly built for himself, which put him at a height that matched his opinion of his own importance. He wore a collar so stiff it looked painted on. When Hannah stepped through the door, he ran his eyes over her from hat brim to shoe-toe the worn hemline, the road dust packed into her eyelets, the suitcase with its broken clasp wired shut, and by the time he finished, He'd already decided. Help you, he said. Hannah set her suitcase down. She kept her voice steady. I'm looking for work. Housekeeping and bookkeeping both, and a place to stay while I find a permanent position. I can work for what I take. Higgins tilted his head. We're not an employment office, miss, I know that. She paused one breath. I could offer something toward the cost. A meal and a room for the night. She reached up and unclasped the pendant from her neck. She laid it on the counter between them. Raw quartz, pale and rough cut, no more than an inch across. It caught the weak light from the window and held it softly. Worth nothing to a merchant. Worth everything to her mother and everything to her. She set it down anyway, because 8 cents wasn't going to buy bread. Higgins picked it up between two fingers. He turned it once, mouth curled. Then he swept it off the counter with the back of his hand. It hit the floorboard with a small hard click and skidded toward the toe of her boot. We don't serve beggars, Higgins said. He said it loud enough to carry. The men at the back of the store went quiet. The woman at the flour bin stopped moving. Everyone heard it. Everyone pretended they hadn't. Hannah's throat pulled tight. The back of her eyes burned. She would not. She absolutely would not cry in this man's store, in front of a room full of strangers on the first afternoon of her new life. She bent down slowly, deliberately, and she picked up her mother's pendant off the dusty floor. She turned it over once in her palm. She clasped it back around her neck. She was still straightening when boots crossed the floor, heavy, even, unhurried, the measured tread of someone with nothing to prove and nowhere to rush. A tall figure stepped out from the shadow near the back counter. He was lean but broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face worn deep by years in open country, dark brown and weathered, with fine lines pressed hard into the corners of his eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult and hadn't fully let go. He wore a plain canvas coat and a hat pushed back on his head. He might have been standing there for 10 minutes. He had the stillness of a man who'd spent a long time watching before speaking. He walked to the counter without hurrying. He reached into his coat and produced 2 silver dollars and set them on the wooden surface with a flat, deliberate thwack that rattled the coin purse on its hook behind the register. Put it on my account, he said. Higgins went pale along the collar line. Mr. Sterling, I didn't ask you to talk. His voice was low, without anger in it, just certainty, quiet and settled, the voice of a man who'd never needed to shout to be heard. He held Higgins' gaze until Higgins found something else to look at. Then, without raising his voice at all, a woman trading honest labor for food carries more dignity than a man selling insults from behind a counter. Nobody in the store made a sound. Higgins picked up the coins. He put them in the till. He said nothing. The man turned to Hannah. Gideon Sterling was somewhere around 36 years old. His eyes were dark and guarded, offering very little. He looked at her directly, and without cruelty taking in facts, not forming a verdict, his face gave nothing away. He wasn't cold so much as closed, like a door that had been shut for a long time and had gotten used to it. You said you have bookkeeping experience, he said. Yes, housekeeping, both. He was quiet a moment. I run a cattle ranch about 20 miles out, Blackwood Ranch beneath the Bighorns. I need someone who can manage the house and read a set of accounts without making them worse. What do you pay? $12 a month. She held his gaze. Fair schedule. Room of my own. I earn what I take. No charity. Something shifted briefly across his expression, small and quickly controlled. The look of a man who'd walked in expecting a simple transaction and found he was negotiating. Agreed, he said. He touched the brim of his hat once in her direction, brief and businesslike, and walked out the door without another word. Hannah stood in the middle of the store with her suitcase at her feet and the pendant settling back against her collarbone. 20 miles out, a ranch beneath the Bighorns. A man who hadn't softened his voice for her, hadn't waited for her gratitude, hadn't explained himself once. He'd simply looked at what was happening, decided what was right, and acted. 8 cents, a law book, and now this. She picked up her bag. Outside, the July sky sat hard and bright blue above the roof lines, and the red dust had settled back into the street, calm and patient, as though the stagecoach had never passed through at all. Down at the far end of the block, Gideon Sterling was untying a bay horse from the rail. Hannah Thorne walked toward him. Behind her, Higgins' door swung shut with a creak. The buckboard rolled north out of Oakhaven on a rutted road that cut through scrub pine and then opened wide into grassland, and Hannah sat on the bench with her suitcase pinned between her feet and watched Montana territory unfold around her. The scrub thinned. The grass came in. Then the Bighorn Mountains climbed up off the horizon. Slow at first, a dark ragged line, and then suddenly undeniable, peak after peak shooting up from the earth without apology. She'd read about them in letters. Her father kept from an old client, a homesteader from Bozeman, who'd needed his deed certified. Her father had read those letters aloud at supper sometimes. He'd said the sky in Montana was a color that didn't exist east of the Missouri. He hadn't been wrong. Gideon drove without looking at her. His hands sat easy on the reins. The bay horse moved in steady rhythm, and the buckboard swayed and creaked and covered ground, and he let it happen. A mile passed. 2 miles. "You have bookkeeping experience," he said. "Not a question exactly." "Since I was 14, Hannah said. "My father kept a law office in Ohio. I took over the accounts when things got difficult." "How difficult?" "Difficult enough that there were no accounts left to manage." He didn't offer condolences. She didn't want any. One nod and back to the road ahead. She studied him from the corner of her eye, the way she studied a dense legal text, looking for the logic beneath the surface. He sat straight, without stiffness. His eyes moved across the landscape in a slow, constant sweep. Tree line, the bluffs off to the west, the sky above the peaks. An ex-Army scout moved exactly like that. She'd seen it once before, in a client of her father's, who'd spent years in open country and came back from it permanently watchful, alert, and settled in the same breath. Gideon Sterling was somewhere around 36 years old, and the years hadn't been easy on him. Deep lines pressed into the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into open country light. His jaw was set in a way that might have been habit or might have been something he was actively holding against. His face was closed, not cruel, not unkind. Just the way a house goes when nobody is living in it anymore. Blackwood Ranch appeared through a gap in the timber, and Hannah understood immediately that it had been something serious once. The main house was wide and low to the ground, built that way on purpose by someone who understood what Montana winters could do to anything that stood up too proud. Solid timber frame, stone foundation, a covered porch running the full front length, stone chimneys at each gable end, good masonry, the kind that didn't crack in the cold. The barn was built for a genuine cattle operation. Tall, broad, post and beam joinery, engineered to hold serious stock through a long winter. But it had been neglected long enough that the neglect had gotten comfortable. The barn's paint had gone from painted to weathered gray. 2 sections of the south fence leaned inward at matching angles. A shutter on the east-facing window of the house hung from a single hinge at a tired diagonal. The porch steps had a board missing at the 3rd tread. A flat stone pressed into the gap in its place, some temporary solution that had become permanent through inattention. The yard was half weeds in the corners. The land underneath it all was still fine, wide-grassed and well-watered under those mountains. A man could run serious cattle here if he'd keep his fences sound. Gideon stopped the buckboard and set the brake. A man came around from the side of the barn at a good clip for someone his age, old and lean and white-haired, with a pushed-back hat and a left knee that moved carefully on uneven ground. He had sharp eyes in a creased open face, and he had his hand out before anyone had said a word. "Elias Court." He said it loud, louder than the quiet yard called for. And as he said it, he angled his head, turning his right ear slightly toward her, his left ear away, a habit worn so smooth it was barely visible. "I handle the livestock in the north pasture." "Welcome, miss." Hannah Thorne. She shook his hand, firmly. Elias grinned and looked sideways at Gideon. She's got a good handshake. Don't make a ceremony of it, Gideon said. From the barn doorway, a second figure appeared and stopped. Compact and square-shouldered, with a carpenter's plane in one hand, and fine sawdust coating both forearms up to the elbow. He had dark, watchful eyes and looked her over, with calm, unhurried curiosity, then lifted his chin briefly and touched 2 fingers to his hat brim. That's Buell, Elias said, pitching his voice toward his better ear. He doesn't use words, doesn't need to. He's the finest woodworker between here and Billings, and he lets the work say what it needs to say. Buell didn't contradict this and didn't elaborate on it either. He turned back through the barn doorway, easy and unhurried, and returned to whatever he'd been doing before. Then, from behind the north rise, came a sharp 2-note whistle and a drumming of hooves. A chestnut horse came over the crest at a full extension gallop, big and fluid, moving with nothing wasted. The man on its back sat the saddle with a stillness that was earned, rather than performed upright, hands quiet, body following the motion of the horse without fighting it. He brought the animal from full gallop to collected trot to a dead stop, in 40 feet, smooth and exact as water slowing through a narrowed channel. Before the horse had finished settling, he was already stepping down. One hand ran briefly down the chestnut's neck. The horse stood. Jasper Wells walked toward them with the unhurried confidence of a man entirely at ease in himself. He was mid-20s, lean and straight, with close-cropped hair and a direct, steady gaze that took things in and kept its own counsel. "Jasper Wells," he said. A brief, firm handshake. "Welcome to Blackwood, Miss Thorne. Good to meet you." Hannah nodded toward the chestnut, still blowing from the run. "That's a clean stop from full gallop. He's well-schooled." Jasper looked at her. A quick, quiet evaluation. "He is," he said. "Took 2 years to get him there. You can see it in him. He goes light in the bridle." "Yes, ma'am." Something shifted behind his eyes, small but real. A door opening an inch. He nodded and let it sit. Whatever he was deciding about her, he was deciding it privately and at his own pace, and that was his right. Gideon was already on the porch. "Inside," he said. Inside was worse than outside, and worse again the further in she went. The front room held a fireplace and 2 chairs, and a table that had been solid furniture once. All of it was filmed in dust, so thick it had developed texture. The windows were gray from it. Cobwebs had claimed the upper corners of every room with the confidence of things that had gone unchallenged for a long time. The braided rug in the hallway had faded past color into something formless and was fraying at both ends. The kitchen made her go still for a moment. The iron stove was caked in old grease layer, overlayer, baked black and rock hard. The pots hung on their hooks. But every interior surface was crusted with the residue of meals cooked by men who had other things on their minds. A tin of cornmeal on the upper shelf had been left open, and moisture had sealed the top inch solid. The floor had a tacky quality that came from not being properly washed in, long enough that the residue had become part of the surface. A fly strip over the dry sink had exceeded its useful life somewhere around the year. Hannah didn't say anything. She made her inventory in order of urgency and moved on. Gideon walked her through the rest, the sleeping rooms, the washroom, the narrow room off the east hallway hers, plain and spare but solid, with a window that opened, which was all she required. At the far end of the central hallway, she stopped. The door there was heavier than the others. Wider frame, iron hinges set deep in the wood, a brass padlock hung through the latch staple. The surface of it eaten through with old rust, rough and pitted and dark. The lock itself was closed tight and showed no signs of being otherwise. She looked at it without touching it. "East room," Gideon said behind her. She turned. His face was giving nothing away. She looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the padlock, and then back at him. "Clean anywhere you like," he said, "except the east room. Don't ask about it, and don't touch it." "All right," she said. He'd been preparing for something else. She caught the slight adjustment in his expression, Not surprise exactly, but a quiet recalibration. He'd loaded himself for argument, and she hadn't given him the target. She turned back toward the kitchen. "Mr. Sterling," he waited. "I want to be plain about something." Her voice stayed level, factual, not combative. "We agreed on $12 a month and fair terms in town. I'll hold to my end of that, and I'll expect you to hold to yours. I don't need direction on how to manage a house, and I don't need checking on. I'll set my own schedule, keep the accounts in clean order, and give you an accurate written inventory at the end of every week." She paused one beat. "If that arrangement suits you, we'll have no trouble," I said. "Agreed in town," he said. "I haven't changed my mind." "Good," she said, and went to find the scrub brush. She found it under the dry sink in a bucket with a repaired cracked pine tar, worked carefully into the seam, and left smooth. Buell's work, she'd wager. She filled the bucket at the outside pump, brought it back in, and got down on her knees in front of the stove with the lye soap. The first hour was the worst of it. Old baked grease doesn't come off in neat sections. It comes off in scrapes, fraction by fraction, your knuckles going raw and the lye biting at your skin. She worked methodically and without complaint. Her father's office in its final hard year had needed similar attention. She'd learned then that there was nothing shameful about getting dirty in the service of putting something right. The dignity wasn't in the ease of the work. It was in doing it honestly. She was on her second bucket when Jasper came through the back door with harness leather coiled over his shoulder and stopped. He looked at the stove. He looked at her on her knees in front of it, arms black to the elbow, then back at the stove. "Need a hand?" he said. "You've got tack to mend," she said. She'd seen the pile stacked inside the barn door. "It'll wait." She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "Are you offering because you think this is too much for one person, or because you'd genuinely rather be in here than working that harness?" He thought about it without hurrying. "Honestly, bit of both." "Finish the tack first," she said. "After supper, if you'd be willing to show me where the firewood splits the cleanest, I'd be glad of that." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he adjusted the harness on his shoulder and went back out. No argument, no ceremony, no making more of it than it was. She heard the sound of the stitching awl starting up outside, steady and methodical. He'd taken her at her word. She appreciated that. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. He propped himself against the frame and angled his right ear into the room and watched her work. "Nobody's touched that stove since Mrs. Whitfield left," he said. "Close to 2 years back." "I can tell," Hannah said. "Mr. Sterling doesn't take much notice of housekeeping matters. That's what I'm here for." Elias was quiet for a stretch. She could feel him sorting through whatever he'd expected and what he was actually seeing. "You're not what I was picturing," he said. "What were you picturing?" He pushed off the doorframe. "Something more unsure of itself." "I'm not sure of much right now," Hannah said, "but I'm sure of this stove." He laughed, too loud and entirely genuine. He went out, shaking his head, and she allowed herself 3 seconds of a smile at the empty kitchen and went back to work. By late afternoon, Buell had appeared on the front porch with a board cut to exact dimension and 4 nails and fixed the missing step without anyone having mentioned it to him. He looked at the new board once, pressed it with one boot to test it, and walked off. By supper, the stove was down to clean iron. The hall rug had been beaten by Elias against the fence post until it surrendered 2 seasons of grime and come back in looking like something. The kitchen table was scrubbed, the window above the sink propped open, cedar shavings on the sill. She cooked salt pork and dried beans and corn dodgers from a meal tin she'd found and cleaned out, and they were simple and hot and put together by someone who paid attention to what they were doing. The men ate without theatrics. Gideon ate all of his and pushed the empty plate to the center of the table when he was done. He said nothing about the food. She noted that. A man who ate every bite without comment was a man who appreciated it, without needing to announce himself. After the men cleared out, Jasper came back to the kitchen door. He set a clean stack of split firewood beside the back door dry, correctly sized, the right wood for a kitchen stove. Then he looked at the oil lamp on the table, moved it 6 inches toward center where the light spread better, and went out without a word. That night, Hannah lay in her narrow room, with the window cracked and the mountain air coming through cold and clean, smelling of pine and something very far back in time. The quartz pendant rested cool at her throat. The ranch was worn down. The man who owned it was shut tighter than that brass lock down the hall. The work ahead was real and heavy, and she was going into it with 8 cents and a law book and a pendant that a merchant had swept onto a dusty floor. She'd made worse starts and still landed on her feet. She put her hand to the pendant and closed her eyes. A full week into Blackwood Ranch, and Hannah had found her footing. She was up before the men each morning and ready before Elias's boots hit the bunkhouse floor. She'd worked through the house room, by room floors scrubbed, windows cleared until the afternoon light actually came through them, curtains beaten and rehung. She'd found the account ledgers in the roll-top desk in the front room and spent 3 evenings sorting the mess of them. Entries that didn't add up, and entries that added up but made no practical sense for a cattle operation. Her father had believed that a clean set of accounts was a form of respect for honest work. She believed it too and meant to prove it. The ranch hands had stopped watching her sideways by the 3rd day. Elias was easy an open-handed man who decided she was fine before the end of the first week and said so, loudly, to nobody in particular, while fixing the north pasture gate. Buell communicated through small completed acts. A wobbly shelf bracket tightened before she'd noticed it was loose. The kitchen door rehung, so it stopped sticking. She'd find these things done and say nothing about them, and he would watch from across the room to see if she'd noticed, and she'd give him a look that said she had. That was their whole working language, and it was enough. Jasper held himself at a slight remove, not unfriendly, not suspicious, just measured. She understood it without needing it explained. A free black man in 1887, Montana had accumulated more reasons than most to take his time assessing people before deciding what to give them. She hadn't tried to rush him through that. She'd treated him precisely the way she treated everyone else on the property directly, honestly, and without making an event of it either way. By the end of the first week, he'd started answering her questions about the cattle count without the small half-second pause that had been there at the beginning. She counted that as real progress. Gideon was something else entirely. He was present without being available. He appeared at meals and said very little and disappeared again. He came to her each week for the account inventory and received it without comment and walked away with it. He wasn't rude. He wasn't difficult. He simply maintained a careful distance from her at all times, and the carefulness of it was more telling than any rudeness would have been. He was managing proximity the way a man manages a fire he's not certain he should approach. She noticed. She filed it away and said nothing. On the 7th morning, she finished the front room curtains before 10 o'clock and decided to do a proper walk of the property. She knew the house and the yard and the well path and the route to the barn, but she hadn't gone further on her own. She went east of the barn, first open pasture. Good grass, 2 horses at the far fence. She came back and went west, following the barn's long side wall. The ground dropped slightly on the west face, falling away toward a flat that she hadn't been able to see from the yard. She turned the corner. There had been a garden here. She stood at the edge of it and understood that, without question. The bones were still visible beneath what several years of unchecked growth had done. Shaped beds outlined in fieldstones, still in their original positions. A path of flat rocks running between them, still mostly intact. A wood trellis against the far fence, one crossbeam, had come loose at one end and hung at a diagonal, but the frame was still standing. Herbs she could identify from the leaf shapes, even under the tangle: yarrow gone woody, sage sprawling wide and untended, dried stalks of lavender that hadn't been cut back in years. A climbing rose on the fence post had gone so thoroughly wild that the post itself was barely visible beneath the growth. And in the center bed, nearly suffocated under a thick mat of bindweed and brome grass, a rose, wild pink, from the pale color of the single bud, still fighting its way through the tangle toward the light. The canes were thin and bent hard to one side by the pressure of the weeds crowding against them. But the bud was there. The plant was alive. She went back to the barn and got the pruning shears. She told herself she was just having a look, just assessing the damage. But she went back to the center bed and knelt in the dirt and started pulling bindweed back from the base of the rosebush, working slowly and carefully to avoid snapping the canes. Bindweed roots go deep and hold hard. The brome grass had knitted itself into a mat beneath the surface. She worked methodically, pulling back by handfuls, and the bud at the top of the rose tilted fractionally more toward the sky as the weight around it eased. The canes had a little more room. She was 20 minutes into it, her hands buried in the weeds at the root zone of the plant, when she heard his boots on the path behind the barn. She'd learned his stride in a week. Even, measured, no hurry. She looked up. Gideon stood at the edge of the garden. It was not the face she'd been seeing at meals, or in the office, or crossing the yard. The face she knew by now was guarded and controlled shut in that habitual way, almost predictable in its blankness. What she was looking at now was not that face. Something had come up through the surface of it, without warning, and without his permission. The muscles at his jaw had gone tight. His eyes were fixed on her and on the rosebush, and on her hands in the dirt around it, and what she saw in those eyes was two things at once, layered so close they were almost the same thing: rage, and underneath it, or wound through it, a pain so old and blunt and worn smooth by time that it had become simply the permanent shape of something he carried. He didn't speak. He just stood there looking. Hannah sat back on her heels. She still held the pruning shears loosely at her side. She did not move. "Get out of there," he said. His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man who's holding something heavy down and can't spare any force for the words. "All right," she said. She stood. She set the shears carefully on the stone path. She came out of the garden bed and stopped, standing at the edge of the border, and looked at him. "Don't come back here," he said. "Don't touch this garden. The roses, the weeds, the trellis, nothing. I understand. I don't need," it explained, "and I don't need your sympathy." "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Looking for the question, she thought. Bracing himself for it. When she didn't ask, something moved in his expression, not relief, not peace, but the faint shadow of it. Then he turned and walked back around the side of the barn. Hannah stood alone in the flat behind the barn. The garden was around her. The bindweed, still heavy. The pink bud still bent slightly sideways under its weight. The lavender gone, woody and gray, from years of winter without care. The loose beam of the trellis hung where it had been hanging. She stood there for a minute. Then she picked up the pruning shears and walked back to the house. She didn't mention it at lunch. She didn't mention it at dinner. She finished the second week's account inventory, wrote it up in clean columns, and returned the ledger to the desk. She hung the remaining east hallway curtain. She did not go back behind the barn, but she thought about it all afternoon. The two things in his eyes at the same time. Rage and grief, so close together she could barely tell where one ended and the other began. A man who could stand in a general store and say without flinching that a woman of honest labor had more dignity than a man selling insults, that man had a bedrock in him that was real. She'd seen it in 2 minutes. But a man who looked at a garden of roses the way Gideon had just looked at her. That man was carrying something private and specific and long-term, and it was costing him. After supper, she took her coffee to the bench at the back corner of the house, away from the front porch. She sat with it and watched the last color leave the mountains, orange bleeding into deep red and then a cold purple. And then the stars came in above the peaks, one at a time, slow and steady, like they had no reason to rush. Elias came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said, too loud as always. "You're not," she said. "Sit if you like." He lowered himself onto the bench with the considered care of a man whose left knee had opinions about cold evenings. He had his own mug. He sat and drank from it and looked at the mountains and said nothing for a while. "I saw him come from behind the barn this morning," he said finally. "Figured you'd found the garden." Hannah said nothing. Elias turned the mug in his big weathered hands. "You want to know about it, only if you want to tell me." He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decided not to. Then he said her name was Lydia. He said it carefully, the name of something he'd said 10,000 times in his head, and stopped saying out loud. "Lydia Sterling," he said. "She planted that garden the first spring after they married. Roses on the trellis, herbs in the center beds. She knew her herbs well, yarrow for cuts and wounds, sage for chest sickness, lavender to help sleep. She was a practical woman, didn't make a fuss, just got things done." He paused. She was good for him, better than good. The stars were coming in steadily above the peaks. 4 winters ago, Elias said, Gideon took a cattle drive south. Started in October, ran long into November. Later than he should have gone, but the market price was right, and he had debts on the ranch that needed settling. Lydia knew the risk of a late drive. She told him to go. He stopped. The bench was cold through Hannah's skirt. The mountain air had an edge to it after dark that it didn't have during the day. She came down with a fever while he was out, Elias said. Winter fever, fast-moving and bad. Buell and I did what we could. We sent 2 riders for the doctor in Oakhaven. He was quiet for a moment. The doctor didn't get there in time. He said the next part without looking at her. When the rider finally caught up with Gideon out on the drive, he turned around and rode hard. 3 days, near enough without stopping. He made it back to Blackwood. He stopped again. She'd been gone for 2 of those days already. Hannah held her coffee with both hands and looked at the mountains and said nothing. "He's blamed himself ever since," Elias said, "for the timing of the drive, for not being here, for every one of those days he spent on the road getting back, while it was already too late. He locked up the East Room the week after the funeral, and that was that. He hasn't touched the garden. He hasn't opened that door." Elias shook his head. "He acts like he's on trial for surviving her, like staying alive when she didn't is a debt he owes, and he's going to spend the rest of his days paying it." He looked down at his mug. "That's no way to live, Miss Thorne." "But I'm a ranch hand. He doesn't hear it from me." "No," Hannah said quietly. "I imagine not." Elias stood, negotiating the cold bench and his knee. He looked down at her with something careful in his expression. "I'm not telling you what to do with that," he said, "just telling you what's there." He touched his hat brim. "Good night." She sat alone for a long time after he went in. Long enough for the last red to leave the sky and the stars to fully settle and the cold to move up from the ground into her hands. Then she went inside. She saw it clearly in the days that followed. Gideon felt the pull of her presence and punished himself for it. She caught it in the small moments, when she handed him the weekly ledger and their hands came near to touching, and he pulled back a half-second early. When she said something at the supper table that made Elias laugh, and something in Gideon's face started toward open and then closed itself back down. When she heard his boots on the front porch slow outside the kitchen window, pause, and start again faster. Each time the feeling moved in on him, he pushed it back and went cold. He was treating what he felt as a kind of betrayal, a disloyalty to Lydia, to her memory, to the grief he'd decided was his permanent occupation. He had turned his own heart into the East Room, locked it, and kept the key and didn't let anyone near the door. By the start of the 3rd week, the cold was noticeable. Questions at the account review got 1 word where they'd gotten a sentence. He stepped wide in the hallway when she was in it. At meals, he found things on his plate to look at. It was not about her, and she knew it. It was about a woman named Lydia, and a winter fever, and a cattle drive that ran 3 weeks too long, and a man who'd been punishing himself for 4 years for something he couldn't have prevented. But she also knew what she knew. On a Thursday evening, 12 days into her time at Blackwood, she found him on the front porch. He sat in one of the two chairs with a cup going cold in his hand, looking north toward the mountains. The sun had dropped behind the peaks, and the light had gone to that flat gray that comes between last color and full dark. It was quiet except for wind in the grass, and somewhere out in the pasture, a horse moving along the fence line. Hannah came out and stood at the porch rail, not beside him, not facing him, just forward, parallel to what he was looking at. She stood there without speaking long enough that he understood she wasn't going back inside. He didn't offer anything. "I'm not going to ask about the garden," she said. He waited, "and I won't say anything about Lydia that you haven't already said to yourself more times than you can count." She kept her eyes on the dark line of the mountains. "But I'm going to say one thing because someone ought to." She turned and looked at him directly. He met her eyes. "Guilt isn't loyalty to the dead, Gideon. It's a rusty nail you drive into your own heart every single day." The porch went very still. Out in the dark pasture, the horse along the fence stopped moving. Gideon looked at her. His face in the low gray light was hard to read, but she held his gaze and didn't pull back from it, and something in his expression shifted, something small and deep. The first trace of movement in something that had been frozen solid for a very long time. Then he looked back at the mountains. Hannah turned back to the rail and stood beside him in the cold and the quiet. She didn't push further. She'd said what was true, and he'd heard it. And what came next was his. Some things needed room to move on their own. The night came in from the east, slow and star-filled, and the mountains stood dark and permanent against it. And neither of them said another word for a long while. They came in the middle of the afternoon on a Tuesday. Hannah heard them before she saw them. The drumming of multiple horses on hard ground too many and moving too deliberately for ranch business. She set down the ledger she'd been working through at the front room desk and went to the window. 5 riders came through the gate in a loose formation. 4 of them had hired gun written all over them, the blank, patient faces of men paid to stand and look dangerous and wait for instruction. The 5th man led them, broad across the shoulders and going thick through the middle, somewhere in his 50s, with a silver-banded hat and a black coat despite the summer heat. He sat his horse with the comfort of a man who'd been making entrances for 30 years and had never once doubted they were his right. Barrett Stone. Hannah knew the name from the account ledgers. It appeared twice in the margin notes, both times in her father's shorthand for a boundary concern. Watch this. She hadn't connected it to a face yet. Now she had one. Gideon came around from the barnyard at a hard pace and stopped in the center of the drive. Elias appeared behind the barn fence. Jasper came out of nowhere and stood near the water trough, one hand resting easy on the post. He wasn't reaching for anything. He didn't need to. Hannah came out onto the porch. Stone pulled up and took his time looking around Blackwood Ranch with a calm, proprietary expression, like a man reading a menu. Then he looked at Gideon. "Sterling," he said. His voice was big and well-practiced. "I won't make a social call out of this. North Spring sits on land that was excluded from your deed in the '81 survey. That water's mine. I've come to collect what's owed." Gideon stood with his hands at his sides. "That spring has watered Blackwood cattle for 6 years," he said. "That survey has been filed, reviewed, and upheld." "Surveys get reviewed again," Stone said, "when new evidence comes forward." "What new evidence?" Stone smiled without warmth. "That's then take it to the courts." "Oh, I intend to. In the meantime, I'm giving you fair notice. Any Blackwood cattle watering at North Spring after Friday noon are trespassing on Stone Creek land." Stone let that sit for a moment. "You've got 500 head, Sterling. That's a lot of animals to go thirsty." The meaning was clear enough. He wasn't coming with a legal victory already in hand. He was coming with a threat designed to force a sale at panic prices before it ever reached a court. A man with 500 thirsty cattle and no water source in a Montana summer had a very short window before he had nothing at all. Hannah watched Gideon's right hand drop to his side. His fingers settled near the holster. The hired guns went still on their horses. One of them shifted his coat back from the left side of his belt. She was off the porch and across the yard before she'd fully decided to move. She came up beside Gideon and put her hand over his on the grip of the gun. He went rigid. She could feel the tension in his whole arm, coiled and loaded, every muscle in it decided. 24 hours, she said. She kept her voice calm and directed it at Stone without taking her hand off Gideon's. Give us 24 hours to review the original deed and survey documents. If your claim holds up, we'll talk terms like civilized people. If it doesn't, I expect you to take your men and leave Blackwood land and not come back. Stone looked at her. Whatever he'd expected, it hadn't been this. He studied her the way he'd study a piece of contract language he hadn't noticed before, calculating whether it would cost him anything. 24 hours, he repeated. That's all we need. A pause. Stone looked at Gideon. Gideon's eyes were flat and steady and said nothing. Noon tomorrow, Stone said. He pulled his horse around. His men turned and followed him back through the gate in the same deliberate formation they'd arrived in, dust rising behind them and settling back slow. When the last rider was through the gate, Gideon took a long breath. His hand moved away from the holster. She stepped back and gave him room, and he stood where he was for a moment, looking at the gate. I appreciate what you just did, he said. You'd have made it worse, she said. He turned and looked at her. A man in a gunfight has a chance of winning, she said. A man sitting in a jail cell waiting for a murder charge to clear, while his cattle die of thirst does not. 24 hours costs you nothing if the deed is sound. And if it's sound, I can prove it. He held her gaze. And if it's not, then we need to know that now, rather than after you've put a bullet in one of his men. He looked at the gate one more time. Then deed box is in the desk. Second drawer, left side. The oil lamp was burning low by 10 o'clock that night. Hannah had spread the deed across the center of the table and anchored the corners with a coffee cup, a horseshoe nail, and 2 river stones from the windowsill. The survey documents were stacked at her right elbow in order of date. She had the territorial land law open to the right section on the left side, her father's copy with its margin notes. She had a legal pad in her own handwriting, filling up steadily. Gideon sat across the corner of the table from her. He'd started the evening across the room, standing near the fireplace. By 9 o'clock, he was in the chair beside her. She read land documents the way her father had taught her, not for summary, but for exact language. Every word in a deed was specific by design, and the places where language went loose or vague were almost always where the argument would eventually find its footing. She moved through the original 1,881 deed, line by line. This parcel line, she said, and turned the document toward him. Junction of the North Tributary and the main creek bed. Look at how it's drawn. He leaned in, and she pointed with her pencil. His shoulder came close to hers. She kept her attention on the paper. The survey line runs to the junction, not through it, she said. North Spring feeds into the tributary 80 yards upstream from that point. If the line stops at the junction, she tapped the map with the pencil. The spring is inside your parcel, not outside it. Gideon studied the document. He was quiet for a moment. Stone's going to argue the tributary itself is the boundary, he might. But look at the approving clerk's notes. She slid the survey attachment forward. He noted the tributary as an interior feature of Parcel 7. Interior, not boundary. That language is deliberate. A boundary feature gets different notation in the 78 Survey Code. She turned to her legal pad and wrote the notation down. It takes someone who knew the 1,878 Territorial Survey Guidelines to see it. And, you know that my father certified land claims for 3 years in Ohio Territory before we moved. I read everything he brought home. She paused. He believed that if ordinary people understood land law, they'd be harder to rob with it. Gideon looked at the survey document for another moment. He looked at her legal pad, the notes in her careful hand. He looked at her face in the lamplight. "This holds up in court?" he said. "If the original document hasn't been altered, yes, we'd need to argue the survey language in front of the territorial judge." She set down the pencil. "The deed is sound, Gideon. What Stone's doing is pressure. He's hoping you make a mistake before you look at the paperwork closely enough." The lamp flame moved in a draft from the window. Shadows shifted across the deed and across his face, and she watched him absorb the ground he was standing on, which was solid, more solid than he'd allowed himself to believe when Stone rode into the yard. "We ride out to North Spring tomorrow and assess the access," she said. "I'll prepare a formal written summary of the survey language tonight. If Stone moves on this legally, we'll have everything ready." She looked at him. "He's banking on the cattle clock. 500 animals, summer heat, no water he thinks you'll sell before the case gets to court. He's been working that play for 10 years in this valley," Gideon said. 3 ranchers sold to him inside of a week because they didn't read the deeds. He sat back. He looked at the table with its spread of documents and her handwriting across the legal pad. The lamp burned steady between them. "Go to bed," he said. "I'll sit with this." She started to stand. "Hannah." She stopped. "Thank you," he said quietly, without difficulty. She left the lamp with him. Stone didn't wait for noon. The news came from a boy on a mule at 7 in the morning, a neighbor's son from a ranch 2 miles east. He was pale and breathing hard when he clattered into the Blackwood yard, and he got the words out in a single rush. Stone's men were at North Spring. They had dynamite. They'd been there since before dawn. They heard the blast from the yard. A single deep concussion rolled down from the hills to the northwest. The horses in the paddock shied and kicked fence boards, and Elias came out of the bunkhouse with his hat still in his hand. 20 seconds of silence. Then the distant grinding of stone, collapsing on stone. Gideon came out of the barn at a run. The sky to the northwest was already dark. Not Stone's doing, that was weather. A fast-moving storm system coming down off the Bighorns, with a blue-black wall of cloud that had been building since yesterday. In Montana, late-season storms came fast and came hard and cared nothing about anyone's plans. "They've blown the North Rock face," Gideon said. He didn't need to explain further. A rock slide across the spring's outlet would back the water up within hours, dam the main flow, before it ever reached the tributary. By nightfall, if the dam held, North Spring would be choked off. 500 cattle. Hannah stood in the yard and ran the numbers the way her father had taught her to run numbers. A healthy steer in summer heat needed water twice daily. 500 animals, no water source. July. You had 48 hours before cattle started going down. After that, the losses would compound faster than you could count them, and the ranch's value would drop with every animal that fell. Stone had moved fast, and he'd moved mean. "I'm riding up," Gideon said. "You and Elias." "I'll come," Hannah said. "No, someone needs to—" "I need you here," he said, sharp and final, not unkind. "If something comes legal while we're out there, you're the one who can answer it. Stay with the ranch." She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she stepped back. Buell was already bringing 3 horses out. Jasper had his rifle in his hand. Elias was pulling on his coat. Gideon went into the barn and came back with his rifle, and the 3 of them rode out of the yard at a hard canter and up toward the northwest hills, where the storm was already swallowing the peaks. Hannah stood in the empty yard. The first thunder came 20 minutes after they left. Low and rolling, the way mountain thunder was reverberating between rock faces until it lost its original shape. Then the wind picked up. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in as many minutes, and the sky went from dark to the specific flat gray that comes just before rain. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window and watched the hills. The rain hit at 9:30, not a building up, not a sprinkle first. Montana storms didn't ease you into it. The rain came full and hard and immediate. hitting the yard in a silver sheet and running down the window glass in solid rivulets. Lightning walked across the peaks in the northwest. The thunder was close enough now that she felt it in the floorboards. They were up in that. She put the kettle on. She checked the medical kit she'd located in the first week and inventoried and reorganized bandaging, carbolic acid, suture needle and thread, surgical scissors. She did this the way she did most things she was worried about. Practical. Purposeful. You don't fix worry by sitting down inside it. She was checking the suture thread when she heard it. 2 horses coming in fast. Too fast. Wrong rhythm, one of them irregular. Stumbling at the canter. She was out the back door before the sound fully registered. Jasper came through the gate first. His face in the rain told her before she'd looked past him. He was leaning far left in the saddle, one hand already behind him, the other pulling his horse sideways to make room for what came next. Elias came through second. He had Gideon's horse on a short lead. Gideon was in the saddle, but barely slumped hard to the right, his left arm pinned against his body, his coat soaked through in blood below the left shoulder that the rain had diluted pink and spread wide across the back of his coat. His eyes were open and tracking, but his face had gone white-gray under the weather tan. Left shoulder, Jasper said. He was already off his horse. Went down in the mud. I got the bullet out as far as I could reach, but it's deep. Hannah was at Gideon's horse before Jasper had finished speaking. Gideon. She put her hand against the side of his face, cold and clammy. Look at me. He looked at her. His eyes were focused, but the focus was costing him. I'm going to need you to get off this horse, she said. Can you do that? I can do it, he said. His voice came out thin. It took all 3 of them. Jasper on his left, Elias on his right, Hannah at the front of the horse keeping it still while they got him down. He made a sound when his left arm moved and didn't make one again. They got him inside and onto the kitchen table, and Hannah cleared the surface with a forearm sweep and got the lamp lit and her medical kit open. She worked. The carbolic acid on her hands, the scissors through his coat and shirt. What Jasper had done in the field had been brave and had bought time the bullet hadn't traveled further in, which meant the bleeding was bad, but not fatal if she moved now. Hold this, she told Elias, pressing a folded cloth hard against the wound. Don't let up. I don't care how hard he grips you. Gideon's right hand found Elias's forearm and gripped it. Elias set his jaw and held on. She sterilized the knife in the lamp flame until the blade glowed, then let it cool for 60 seconds. Then she went in. Gideon's whole body went rigid, and he ground his back teeth together, and the grip on Elias's arm went white-knuckled, and he made no sound. Sweat broke across her forehead from the close heat of the lamp and the concentration, and she held herself perfectly steady and followed the track of the wound and found the bullet fragment lodged against the rear of the deltoid muscle and extracted it in 2 careful movements. She had it out and dropped it on the table with a small, hard sound. She cleaned and packed and sutured and bandaged and didn't stop until the work was done. Elias exhaled for what sounded like the first time in 10 minutes. Jasper was looking at her with a calm, open expression. You've done that before, he said. Farm accident, she said, when I was 17. Our neighbor's youngest. She tied off the last bandage. I had the book in a very steady hand, and I prayed harder than I have since. She looked at Gideon. His eyes had closed. His breathing had evened out into something closer to rest than unconsciousness. Color was coming back into his face in slow increments. The spring, she said. Jasper sat down heavily at the table. The rock slide dammed it. Stone's men had lookouts posted. When we came up, it went to guns. His eyes went to Gideon. We held the high ground long enough to confirm. The dam is solid rock, 20 feet across. Moving it by hand in this rain, that's 2 days of work with full crew and equipment. Stone's injunction comes before we can move the cattle, Elias said. He'd sat down in the chair against the wall and was looking at his hands. No water for 500 head in this heat, Hannah. We lose animals inside of 2 days. The storm hammered against the windows. Lightning printed the yard white for a split second, and the thunder came immediately after. Gideon lay still on the table, breathing steady, shoulder-wrapped, lost to a deep, exhausted sleep. She was standing over the medical kit, closing it up when she heard horses on the drive, not the fast, hard canter of an emergency. Deliberate, paced, she went to the front window. One horse, a rider in a town coat, a tin badge catching the lamplight from the front room, even through the rain. Behind him, one deputy, the sheriff of Oakhaven. His name was Doyle. She'd seen him once in town, talking to Stone's foreman at the far end of Main Street, with the comfortable familiarity of men who met often and always with purpose. She opened the front door before he knocked. Doyle looked at her without surprise. A man carrying papers tends to expect trouble at the door. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, wet at the corners from the ride, and held it out. "Emergency writ of attachment," he said. "Issued this evening by Judge Haverford at the request of Barrett Stone. Blackwood Ranch is legally barred from driving cattle to North Spring for a period of 48 hours, pending court review of the disputed water rights claim." He said it like he'd read it twice on the ride over and had it memorized. "I need to see Gideon. Sterling, Mr. Sterling, is incapacitated," Hannah said. "He sustained an injury tonight." Doyle studied her face. "I'll accept the writ on behalf of Blackwood Ranch," she said. She held out her hand. He looked at her hand. He looked at the badge and the deputy and the document, and she looked at none of those things. She just kept her hand out. He put the paper in it. 48 hours from the time of issue," he said. 11 tonight. She looked at the document. The ink was barely dry. "Good evening, Sheriff," she said, and closed the door. She stood in the front hall with the writ in her hands and the sound of the retreating horses fading into the rain. From the kitchen came the slow, even sound of Gideon's breathing. 48 hours. 11 o'clock tonight was the clock starting. By 11 o'clock Thursday, she needed a legal reversal, or 500 cattle were going to start dying. Gideon was down. Stone's dam was across the spring. The corrupt sheriff had delivered his paper and ridden away satisfied. She walked back to the kitchen table and set the writ down under the lamp. She stood over it and read every word. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be steady when everything else wasn't, because her father had taught her that the time you most needed to read carefully was exactly when panic was telling you to put the paper down. She read it twice. Then she pulled out her legal pad and found a clean page and started writing. The storm sat on the valley all night. Thunder moved in cycles distant for an hour, then close, then distant again, like something pacing. Rain hit the roof in hard, variable bursts, easing for 20 minutes and then doubling back with purpose. Hannah kept the kitchen lamp burning and worked at the table and listened to the weather and listened to the quiet from the back room where Gideon lay. At midnight, the quiet from the back room changed. She heard it before she could name it. A different quality to the silence, a restlessness in it. She picked up the lamp and went down the hall. He was awake, or close to it. His eyes were half open and tracking the ceiling without focus. And when she set the lamp on the side table and put her hand to his forehead, he was burning. Post-wound fever. It came on in the hours after, once the initial shock had passed and the body had taken stock of the damage and started its own war against it. She'd seen it come within the hour, and she'd seen it take until morning. His had taken until midnight. "Gideon," she kept her voice low and level. His eyes moved to her face. He saw her. She was in there, somewhere behind the heat. "I need to change the dressing," she said. "It's going to hurt." "Do it," he said, rough from the fever. She worked carefully. The bandaging came away, and she cleaned the wound with carbolic diluted water and examined the sutures holding. No sign of sepsis yet. The tissue inflamed, but not suppurating. Good. She repacked it and began rebandaging, pulling the cloth firm. And even when she pulled the last wrap tight, his right hand came up and closed around her wrist. Not grabbing, not demanding, just holding. The grip of a man in real pain who'd run out of other places to put it. She went still. His eyes were closed. His jaw was set. He was gritting through the fever and the wound both in silence, without asking anything from anyone. She turned her hand slowly in his grip until her palm was against his, and her fingers could close around his hand. She held on. His jaw eased a fraction. The muscles in his forearm gradually unlocked. The sweat on his forehead caught the lamplight, and she sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand and let the storm do what it was going to do outside. After a while, his breathing deepened and steadied. She eased her hand free and went back to the table. She had Stone's supporting documents spread under the lamp, not just the writ, but the full body of paperwork Doyle had delivered as attachments. The territorial court required supporting evidence for an emergency writ of attachment. Stone had submitted what looked like a secondary survey document dated August 1879, purporting to revise the boundary of Parcel 7 and exclude North Spring from the Blackwood deed. She read it 3 times. Then she got the magnifying glass from the desk drawer. The document was period appropriate in most respects. Paper, ink, territorial seal. All of it looked right at first glance and at second glance and at third. Stone hadn't done this carelessly. He'd had time to do it well, but the signature at the bottom of the approving clerk's notation gave her pause. H. Montgomery, August 10, 1879. She'd seen that name before, not in Blackwood's documents. Somewhere further, back in her memory of her father's office, in the specific place, she'd filed legal details that had struck her as worth keeping. She sat back and let it come. 1881. Her father had taken a land certification case for a homesteader in eastern Ohio, a boundary dispute that hinged on a clerk's approval notation. The opposing party had submitted a document signed by a territorial clerk, and her father had spent 2 weeks verifying the clerk's term of service. A clerk could only authorize documents during their active appointment. Signatures outside that window were legally void. The document became nothing, worth less than the paper it was printed on. H. Montgomery. She thought she had the name somewhere in her father's handwriting. She couldn't be certain, but she had the method, the practice. Verify the clerk's active dates against the document's date and see if they match. She pulled Blackwood's original 1,876 land grant from the deed box and every subsequent document that bore a territorial clerk's signature. In 3 of them, from 1,876 and 1,878, the approving clerk was listed as W. Hartley. H. Montgomery appeared in only one the disputed 1,879 revision Stone had filed with the court. One document, one clerk whose name appeared nowhere else in 6 years of Blackwood paperwork. Signature dated August 10, 1,879. She needed the death record or the term of service record for H. Montgomery. One or the other would settle it. Jasper appeared in the kitchen doorway. He hadn't slept, she'd known he hadn't, from the occasional sound of him moving in the yard during the night, making sure the horses were secure, checking the barn doors against the wind. He stood there looking at her, and he didn't ask what she needed. He waited for her to tell him. "I need the church death registry from Oak Haven," she said, "or the county clerk appointment records from the territorial office." Either one, she looked up at him. Tonight, he didn't hesitate. Stone has men on the North Road. I know. I can go around through the South Canyon. It's longer, but it skirts his patrol line. He was already working it out in his head routes, and timing and risk, the calm precision of a man who'd spent years moving through country that wasn't friendly to him, and had learned to plan accordingly. "It's a bad night to ride," she said. "It's a worse night to lose the ranch," he said. She looked at him steadily. She thought about all the reasons a man in his position had to stay safe and stay quiet and not ride through a storm into a hostile town on an errand that put him directly in the path of Barrett Stone's hired guns. She thought about what it cost to do it anyway. "The church is on Meridian Street," she said. Father Callan keeps the records in the vestry, left side cabinet. If the church is locked, try the land office on Canal. They keep clerk appointment logs going back to territorial incorporation. I'll find it, he said. He was gone before she'd finished speaking. She heard his horse leave the yard heading south, and then the rain took the sound. She went back to the documents and waited. The storm cycled. Rain, pause, rain again. Around 2 in the morning, she heard Gideon turn in the back room and go still. She checked on him at 2 and at 3. The fever held steady high, but not climbing, which was the best she could ask for at this hour. She made coffee she didn't particularly want, and drank half of it, and kept working through the papers, cross-referencing dates and notations, building the argument on the page into something clean and provable. Elias came in from the bunkhouse at 4, with the quiet entrance of a man who'd decided sleep wasn't coming. He sat at the far end of the table with his own cup and didn't say much. "He's resting," she said before he could ask. "Jasper's not back yet," Elias said. "He'll be back." Elias looked at her. "You sure?" She thought of Jasper on that chestnut horse coming over the north rise at full extension. The absolute command of that stop. The animal's trust, completely given and completely earned. "Yes," she said. At 5:15, with the storm finally thinning to a gray, steady drizzle, and the first pale light beginning to outline the peaks, she heard hooves on the soft mud of the yard. Jasper came through the back door, wet to the skin. He set a cloth-wrapped parcel on the table in front of her without a word. She unwrapped it. The Oakhaven Church of Christ Parish Register. Death records, 1,870 through 1,883. She opened it at the beginning of the 1870s and moved forward year by year, name by name. She found it in May 1877. Henry Archibald Montgomery, age 54. Died May 3rd, 1877. Cause, consumption of the lungs, duration 14 months. She read it twice. H. Montgomery, dead in May of 1877. The document Stone had submitted to the court bore his signature, dated August 10, 1879. 2 years and 3 months after the man was in the ground. She set the register down and looked at it for one long moment. "Forged," Elias said quietly. He'd leaned over to read, angling his good ear away and his eyes close to the page. "Every word of it," Hannah said. Jasper stood across the table with the look of a man who'd ridden through a dark, wet, dangerous night for a reason, and had found the reason good. "Court opens at 9, he said. She was already gathering the documents. Oakhaven's territorial court met in the back room of the Broken Spur Saloon. This was not a temporary arrangement. It had been the arrangement for 11 years, and the room had absorbed all 11 of those years into its walls, cigar smoke, whiskey vapor, and the accumulated weight of decisions made by men who were comfortable making them. The wood had taken on a permanent brown cast that had nothing to do with the varnish. 3 long benches for the public. A raised platform at the far end with a wide table for the judge. 2 chairs for the arguing parties, set at opposite angles in front of the platform with the uncomfortable intimacy of a boxing ring. Barrett Stone was already seated when Hannah arrived. He had his lawyer with him, a thin, paper-colored man named Creech, who practiced out of Billings, and had the quiet confidence of someone who'd won in rooms like this one before and expected to again. Stone himself sat with his arms crossed and his expression neutral, the face of a man saving his energy for the moment it mattered. The room was full of men, ranch hands, townspeople, 2 representatives from the land office with notebooks. Obadiah Higgins sat in the second row, with his collar buttoned to the throat and his face arranged into careful neutrality that would tip toward whichever side looked like winning. She'd learned to read that expression in the first 5 seconds of knowing him. Hannah set her documents on the petitioner's chair and looked at the room. The room looked back. A woman, 24 years old, no legal credential beyond her father's library and 3 weeks of ranch bookkeeping. presenting against a man who had purchased water rights and county officials across 3 Montana counties. Someone in the back row said something low to the man. Beside him, both of them smiled. She set her jaw and organized her papers. Judge Aldous Hargrove came in from the side door at 8 minutes past 9, a big man gone soft through the middle, with white side whiskers and the unhurried movements of someone who believed rooms should wait for him. He settled into his chair and looked at everything over his spectacles. "Injunction matter," he said. "Stone versus Sterling. Who speaks for Blackwood Ranch?" "Hannah Thorne." She stood. "On behalf of the ranch and Mr. Sterling, who sustained a firearm injury in last night's incident at North Spring." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. He didn't say anything objectionable. He wrote something down and looked at Creech. Creech went first. He was smooth and unhurried, and he laid out Stone's claim in clean, practiced language, submitting the disputed 1,879 survey document as primary evidence. He let it speak, rather than pushing it. The approving clerk's signature, the revised boundary notation, the specific exclusion of North Spring from the Blackwood parcel, all presented as straightforward and settled, a matter of record rather than argument. He sat down without flourish. The room felt tilted. Hargrove looked at Hannah. She stood up. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't expected it. She'd been steady through the entire night, through the fever watch and the dressing changes and the hours at the lamp. And now, in front of this room, full of men who were waiting for her to fail, her hands had decided otherwise. She lifted her documents. The stack slipped. Papers came off the bottom in a long, slow fan and hit the saloon floor in front of the entire room. The sound of them landing was very loud in the quiet. Someone in the back laughed brief, quickly covered, but she heard it clearly. She stood over the scattered papers. She looked at the floor. The room went absolutely still. Then the saloon doors opened. The light from outside came through in a long bar and cut the smoke sideways, and everyone on the back benches turned to look. Gideon Sterling walked in. He was pale in the way of a man who'd lost blood recently and hadn't fully taken it back. His face was flat with the effort of staying upright on will rather than strength. His left shoulder was wrapped in bandaging, visible beneath his open coat, fresh white cotton, with a single dark stain at the center that hadn't been there when she'd checked the dressing at 6 in the morning. He'd ridden 12 miles in a drizzle on a shoulder that should have kept him flat in bed for a week. He stopped just inside the doors and looked at the room once, one slow, complete sweep. Then he looked at her. No pity in it, no alarm at the papers on the floor, no urgency. Just a steady, level look that said he was there. He'd come on purpose, and he wasn't going anywhere. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she bent down and collected her papers from the floor. She stacked them against her palm, straightened them once, turned to face the judge. Her hands were steady. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to the approving clerk's signature on the document Mr. Creech submitted." She walked forward and placed the survey document on the judge's table. The signature reads H. Montgomery, dated August 10, 1879. Montgomery served as a territorial records clerk and held authorization to sign survey approvals during his active appointment. That authority was real and legitimate. She paused one beat. But only until May 3rd, 1877. She set the parish register on the table beside the survey document. "This is the Oak Haven Church of Christ Death Register, 1870 through 1883. I draw the court's attention to the entry dated May 3rd, 1877. She opened the register to the marked page and set it in front of Hargrove. Henry Archibald Montgomery. Deceased. Cause, consumption of the lungs. The room was very quiet. The document Mr. Stone submitted to this court bears the signature of a man who had been dead for 2 years, and 3 months on the date it was allegedly signed. She looked at Hargrove without blinking. "That document is a forgery." The emergency writ of attachment issued on its basis was built on fabricated evidence and must be dismissed in its entirety. Creech was on his feet. Your Honor, the authenticity of this register is verifiable by anyone in this room who can read, Hannah said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The register is a church record, kept by 3 consecutive pastors and available for public inspection at the Oak Haven Church of Christ any day of the week. I welcome Mr. Creech to verify the entry personally. He'll find exactly what I've just shown you. Creech looked at Stone. Stone's face had gone very still. Hargrove lifted the death register and read the entry. Set it down. He lifted the survey document and examined the signature. Set it down. He sat back and looked at Stone from beneath his white side whiskers for a long moment that had real weight to it. Then he looked at the room. Every man on every bench was watching. The land office representatives had their pens out. Higgins sat in his stiff collar in the second row with his mouth slightly open. Hannah looked at them all. She thought of her father reading territorial law letters at the supper table, explaining why each word mattered and who lost when ordinary people didn't understand what they'd signed. She thought of 3 ranchers in this valley who'd sold to Stone in a single week because they hadn't read the documents closely enough and nobody had been there to read them for them. Western law wasn't written to serve rich men's wallets, she said. It exists so the poorest among us can stand tall on their own land. Nobody in the room made a sound. Hargrove picked up his pen. The emergency writ of attachment in the matter of Stone versus Sterling is hereby invalidated, he said. His voice was even and carried well in the low room. Blackwood Ranch is restored full access to North Spring, effective immediately. He wrote as he spoke, pen moving in short, deliberate strokes. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the fraudulent survey document to the Territorial Attorney's Office for full investigation into its origin and authorization. He set the pen down and looked at Stone over the spectacles. Mr. Stone, you will remain available to this court. Stone said nothing. His lawyer said nothing. Stone looked at his hands, resting on his knees for a moment. Then he stood and walked out of the Broken Spur without speaking to a single person in the room. Hargrove gathered his papers, rose, and went back through the side door. The room exhaled at once. Hannah stood at the petitioner's chair and breathed. She kept her face composed while she tucked the death register and the Blackwood deed back into their envelopes, working through each one in order. Her hands were still steady. She intended to keep them that way until she was outside. Boots crossed the floor behind her, even and measured. Gideon stopped beside her. He looked at the death register on the judge's table, still open to the marked page, and at the forged document beside it. Then he looked at her face. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Good. He turned and started back toward the saloon doors. She watched him go pale and tight-shouldered and completely upright, moving through the room without announcement or apology. At the door he stopped and glanced back once. A brief look, carrying more than he'd ever say out loud. Then he went out into the morning light, and the door swung shut behind him. Hannah gathered the last of her documents and tucked them under her arm. Around her, the room was emptying, benches scraping on the floor, smoke drifting in the draft from the open door. In the second row, Obadiah Higgins stood and straightened his coat. He caught her eye briefly. Then he looked down at his hat in his hands and walked out without a word. She noted that. She noted it carefully. She walked out of the Broken Spur saloon into the cool September light. The days after the ruling settled in quietly. Stone pulled his men back from North Spring the morning after Hargrove's decision, without confrontation and without comment. A neighbor to the east reported seeing Stone's hired guns riding out of Oak Haven on Friday, with their gear packed heading back toward Stone Creek Estate without looking back. The valley absorbed their departure the way it absorbed most things without ceremony. The rock slide at North Spring took 4 days to clear. Gideon worked it alongside the crew with his shoulder still healing. ignoring the tight expression that crossed his face when he pushed too hard. Nobody said anything about it. Buell engineered a timber frame to redirect the water flow around the worst of the rubble, while the main channel was opened by hand. The cattle reached the spring on the second afternoon and stood in the cold water drinking, without any apparent appreciation for what it had taken. Stone remained in Oak Haven through that first week. Hannah saw him once from across Main Street on the hotel porch, with his hands on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. A man reassessing ground he'd been certain of for 30 years, still bitter, still capable, but quiet. It was a Thursday, 12 days after the ruling, when the Canyon Road changed everything. Hannah was riding south with Gideon and Jasper to check the storm-damaged fence line along the south pasture. The September sky ran clear and blue overhead, but the creek alongside the road was still running high and fast and brown from 3 days of upstream rain. They smelled it before they heard it. Cold, raw earth, the smell that runs ahead of moving water. Then the roar built around the south bend, climbing fast from nothing to everything. The flash flood came around the bend chest high and hard moving, carrying it all with it. Grub pine wire, fence posts still strung together, sections of undercut bank, and in the middle of it, coming broadside, and already finished, Stone's heavy supply wagon. The current took it and tipped it, and it went over with a crash of splintering wood and iron. The two draft horses tore free and swam hard and made the bank. The wagon drove into a flat rock shelf on the near side and stopped, half submerged, one rear wheel, still turning slow in the current. Stone was beneath it, one arm thrust out of the water, gripping the shelf, his head barely above the surface. The wagon had him pinned at the legs, and the current was working on him steadily, patient and indifferent. Gideon was off his horse. The same second, Hannah registered the arm above the water. He pulled the rope from his saddle and passed one end to Jasper without speaking. He tied the other end around his waist with the fast, exact knot of a man who'd dealt with moving water before and understood what the alternative was. He read the current, once angle, depth, where the rocks were, and stepped off the bank. The water hit him left, and he worked against it at a diagonal, using the current's own force rather than fighting it directly. He reached the wheel hub and got both hands on it. "Pull!" he called back. Hannah had the block and tackle out of the saddlebag. She couldn't have said precisely when she'd grabbed it. Jasper had the setup rigged over the horn in seconds and looked at her. She looked at the angle of the wagon against the shelf and pointed left of the rock face, where the leverage would let the wheel lift cleanest. Jasper moved the horse left without question. The rope pulled taut. The wheel lifted. Gideon got his shoulder under the frame, and Stone came free from the mud and the pull of the water, and they both went with the current for 20 feet before Jasper brought the tension right, and Gideon found the creek bottom with his feet and stood. They dragged Stone up onto the bank and into the mud and the cold air. Stone lay on his back, shaking. Gray in the face, the specific gray of a man who has been very close to something final and returned from it not entirely by his own effort. His right leg was broken badly. The angle at mid-thigh said it plainly. Hannah split 2 straight pine branches with Jasper's hatchet and tore strips from her riding skirt hem without deliberating and went to work. Stone gripped the mud of the bank with both hands and held still while she set the splint. He was looking at Gideon when he said it. Gideon stood at the water's edge, soaking wet, watching the current ease. Stone looked at him from the ground with an expression that had never crossed his face in any store or courtroom or ranch yard. "Why save the man who tried to ruin you?" Stone said, stripped of everything else. Just the question. Gideon looked at him. "I saved a drowning man, not an enemy," he said. "Your cruelty won't strip away my humanity." Stone looked at the sky, said nothing more. Hannah tied off the last strip and pressed the splint to check it held. Around them, the flood had eased, still high, still running, but the worst of it passed. Jasper was up the bank, talking quietly to the horses. They waited an hour until Stone's men arrived from the high pasture. They came with a blanket stretcher and took him up the canyon road carefully. Halfway up, Stone looked back once. She couldn't name what was in that look. She didn't try to. Gideon watched them go until the road bent and took them. Then he looked at Hannah at the mud on her skirt, the bark still caught on her cuffs, the torn hem. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She looked at him, standing there dripping in the September afternoon, creek water darkening his coat, shoulder bandaging soaked through you. He was quiet, a beat. "Been colder," he said. They rode back to Blackwood through the long afternoon light. The mountains ahead of them had gone gold, and the canyon behind them was already settling back toward quiet. The flood had begun pulling from its high water mark, leaving a dark line on the rock faces. Neither of them spoke much on the ride home. There wasn't much that needed saying. The letter from Stone's lawyer arrived on a Monday. Elias brought it from town, with a face arranged in careful neutrality, which he maintained all the way from the gate to the porch, where Hannah was working through the weekly inventory. He handed it over without comment and went to find something to do at the barn. She read it. Then she brought it inside to Gideon. Barrett Stone had apparently done serious accounting from his hotel bed while his leg knitted. The letter was precise and plain. Stone was withdrawing all water rights claims against properties in the valley. He was offering a financial settlement to the 3 ranchers who had sold to him, under pressure, over the previous 4 years fair market value for their land, with the option to repurchase. No public statement, no explanation offered. His lawyer had simply written it down and sent it. Gideon read it, standing at the desk. He set it down and stood at the window. "Huh," he said. "Yes," Hannah said. He looked at the paper for another moment. Then he picked it up again, folded it carefully, and put it in the desk drawer, not dismissing it, placing it where it belonged. A settled thing. Word moved through the valley, the way word always moved, in a place that sighs fast and thorough, and ahead of anyone's announcement. By Thursday, the 3 ranchers who'd lost their properties had received Stone's formal written offers. 2 of them had already accepted. The 3rd was expected to by the end of the week. The Valley ranchers met at the Broken Spur on Friday evening, not a formal gathering, just men who ended up in the same room and had things to say to one another. Hannah heard about it from Elias, who'd been present. "They talked about you," Elias said, in his too loud voice, angling his good ear toward her. "And Mr. Sterling, most of the night. I hope they settled on something more interesting than that," Hannah said. He grinned. They settled on a lot of things. The following morning was a Saturday, cool and clear. The Byhorns wore their first early autumn color above the tree line, the high slopes gone amber between the dark pine. The harvest work had shifted into its steady rhythm at Blackwood, Jasper, and Elias. On the North Pasture Buell, resealing the barn roof before the cold came in. Hannah was coming down the central hallway with the bookkeeping ledger. When she heard him, Gideon was standing at the far end of the hall. In front of the east room, he had the rust-pitted brass key in his right hand. He stood looking at the door for a moment, and then he looked up and saw her. He didn't look away. He stood straight in the half-light of the hall, holding the key, and looked at her directly. She walked to him. He turned to the padlock. The key went in, and he worked it carefully. The lock had been closed long enough that there was resistance in the mechanism, a dry resistance that needed patience. He worked it slowly, without forcing it, and the lock came open with a sound that seemed loud in the quiet hall. He removed the padlock, set it on the floor, put his hand to the door, and pushed it open. Sunlight came through. The east room faced east and south, both, with 2 windows that had been shut and curtained for 4 years. And when the door opened, the light poured in so suddenly that she had to let her eyes adjust. Dust moved in the long bars of it, spinning slow. The room held a narrow bed, a reading chair, a bookshelf along the inner wall, a small writing desk under the east window. A braided rug on the floor faded now, but she could still see the pattern in it, blue and rose and deep green. worked by careful hands. On the writing desk lay a book, a single volume, the cover worn smooth from regular reading. She could make out the spine, Great Expectations. Dickens. Gideon crossed to the desk. He picked up the book with both hands. He held it for a moment, not reading it, not opening it. Just holding it the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical dimension. Then he walked to the bookshelf and placed it on the center shelf, upright, the spine facing out. He set it neatly, squarely, in exactly the right position. Then he went to the south window and unlatched it and pushed it open. The mountain breeze came through, clean and cold, and carrying the smell of pine and high elevation, and the faint sweetness of the last warm grass before the season turned. The curtain lifted and the light shifted, and the room, shut and stilled, for 4 years breathed. He stood at the window with his back to her. She waited. When he turned around, his face was open in a way she had never seen it. Not unguarded, that wasn't it exactly. It was more that the guard had been deliberately set down, placed to one side on purpose by a man who had decided the effort of maintaining it was finally something he was done with. He crossed the room to her. He reached out, and his fingers found the quartz pendant at her throat, touching it lightly. Just his fingertips at the edge of the stone, the pale rough surface of it that her mother had worn, and that a merchant had swept onto a dusty floor, and that she had kneeled in public to retrieve without apology. He looked at the pendant, and then he looked at her. "Lydia belongs to my cherished memories," he said. "But you, Hannah." He paused one breath. "You are my present, my life, and my future." The room was very quiet. Mountain air moved through the open window, and the curtain lifted again, and the light was everywhere. In the dust and the pale walls, and the bookshelf where the Dickens novel stood clean on the center shelf. She looked at him, at the face she had been reading for weeks, the lines pressed in by years of open country and open grief, the jaw that had been set against something difficult. For so long it had become habit, the dark eyes that had been closed and closed and closed, until right now, right this moment, when they were not. She put her hand over his, where it rested at her pendant. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't already said. He was her present, too. Had been, she thought, since a general store in July, when a tall man stepped out of the shadows and put $2 silver on a counter and looked at a merchant with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who knew what dignity was and was not willing to watch it swept off a counter. She had just needed the distance to see it clearly. Through the open window, the Byhorns stood in the autumn morning, permanent and cool, and the same as they had been, unchanged by anything that had happened in the small human world below them. The breeze came and went and again. Gideon's hand turned under hers until his fingers closed around her hand. They stood in the sunlight in the open east room, and neither of them moved for a long time. Autumn came to Blackwood Ranch in long golden sheets. The grass in the north pasture went amber first, then the higher ground followed, turning color from the peaks down. The bighorns above the tree line ran in rust and ochre between the dark pine, and the morning light hit the ranch buildings at a low angle that made everything look deliberate. The barn boards, the stone chimneys, the fence lines Buell had spent September reinforcing post by post. The air had a clarity to it that July and August didn't offer. Every edge sharpened up. Hannah rode into Oakhaven on a Thursday in October. The buckboard moved down Main Street in the cool mid-morning, and she pulled up in front of Higgins's general store, set the brake, and stepped down. She had a supply list in her coat pocket, and a clear sense of what she needed and where to find it. She'd been doing this run every 2 weeks since August. Obadiah Higgins was sweeping his front step. He looked up when she came through the gate, and then, without hurry or elaboration, he removed his hat and tilted his head in a genuine nod, not a performance, not a calculation of who was watching, just a man with a hat tipping it. "Miss Thorne?" he said. "Good morning, Mr. Higgins," she said. "Good morning." He held the door for her. She went inside. She didn't hold July against him. She never had. particularly not because what he'd done was acceptable, but because she'd seen enough of the world to understand that people arranged themselves around power and rearranged themselves when the power shifted. Holding a permanent grievance against that kind of ordinary human weakness was a full-time occupation that produced nothing worth having. What she preferred was what she could see right in front of her, a man who had learned, by watching something real happen, that there were people in this valley worth respecting. That was a lesson worth keeping. However, it had arrived. He had the right canned goods waiting. Before she'd finished reading the list, he charged her fairly and made correct change. She thanked him and left. The East Room had been transformed by late September. It was Jasper who had suggested it, which surprised no one who knew him well. He'd come to her on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and said that he'd been thinking about the room, about whether it was going to sit there now waiting for a purpose, or whether it could be made into something. She'd looked at him for a moment. "What would you put in it?" she said. He'd looked at his hat. "Books," he said quietly. A proper school table. She'd gone to Gideon that evening. He'd listened to the whole idea without interrupting. Then he'd nodded once and gone out to the barn, and the next morning Buell had started building. By the first week of October, the East Room had a long, low table running its center length and 4 ladder-back chairs along each side, and the bookshelves reorganized to hold the volumes Hannah had sent for, from the Billings Lending Library primers and readers and basic arithmetic texts, and 2 copies of the Territorial Land Law, one of which was her father's. She'd had the spine remended by Buell's patient hand, with fresh linen and paste. Jasper came on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the day's ranch work started. He sat at the table with a primer and worked through it methodically, with the same focused patience he brought to training horses, no rushing, no shortcuts, understanding that the ground had to be covered at whatever pace the ground required. He was reading well inside of 3 weeks, full sentences by the end of the month. "You catch on fast," Hannah told him one morning. "I've been wanting to since I was 7, he said, and went back to the page. 3 children from a neighboring homestead family came on Wednesday afternoons. Their mother brought them the first time and stayed in the doorway watching, and by the second week she was at the table herself, working through the primer alongside her oldest. Hannah taught all 4 of them without distinction and without condescension. Her father had believed that reading was the most practical skill a person could possess, and that every hour spent teaching, it was an hour's work that would compound forward for the rest of a person's life. She believed the same. The homesteaders started coming in 1s and 2s by November. Word moved through the valley the woman at Blackwood who understood land deeds. She set up a single evening each week, Wednesdays, when she'd sit with anyone who brought documents and walk them through what they held in their hands. Water rights, boundary notations, survey clerk signatures, the specific language of easements and parcel exclusions. She showed them what to look for and how to read it, and what questions to ask a court if something didn't align. Several of them had been sitting on documents for years, assuming the contents were what someone else had told them they were. Some of them had been told correctly. A few had not. Those few she helped. The last Wednesday in October was clear and cold, the sky above the bighorns going dark blue in the late afternoon, with the first serious edge of winter in it. The valley below was still in full autumn color, gold and rust and pale amber as far as the eye could carry, the creek flashing silver in the low light where it turned south past the ranch's lower pasture. Hannah came out onto the porch with a cup and leaned on the rail. She heard him before he appeared his even, unhurried step on the board floor of the front room, and then he was behind her, and his arms came around her from behind, easy and certain, and his chin came to rest near her temple. They stood looking at the bighorns in the last of the light. The peaks had their first snow at the very top, just a dusting, thin and white against the dark rock, there and not quite there. The sky above them burned in the west, deep orange, going to red, going to a color that didn't have a simple name. The valley below it held the last warmth of the afternoon, while the cold came down from the high ground. Gideon looked at the pendant at her throat. The raw quartz caught the last slant of evening light and held it, warm and pale and unpolished, the same as it had always been, exactly as her mother had worn it, exactly as she had laid it on a dusty counter, and then picked it up from a dusty floor and clasped it back around her neck in front of a room full of strangers. "Have you found the true value of your necklace?" he said. She felt the rumble of his voice against her back. She looked at the mountains and at the pendant and at the valley going gold in the last light, and she smiled. "I never lost it," she said. "I just had to travel far enough to find someone who knew how to treasure it." The sun dropped behind the peaks, and the light changed, the color deepening from gold to copper to the long blue dusk of a Montana October evening. The stars would be out before long. First one, and then the rest, the way they always came in above the bighorns, slow and patient, and without hurry. The pendant rested warm at her throat. Gideon held her, and they stood on the porch of Blackwood Ranch and watched the last light go. And neither of them moved until the evening star came in above the highest peak, clear and steady, and the first of many. There's a reason stories like this one stay with us long after the last page turns. It's not the gunfight. It's not the courtroom. It's not even the moment Gideon finally opens that door at the end of the hall. It's something quieter than all of that. It's a woman kneeling on a dusty floor to pick up something a cruel man threw down and standing back up without asking anyone for permission to hold her head high. That image is the whole story in one breath. And if you've ever had to do that, if you've ever had to pick yourself up off the floor while the room watched, then you already understood Hannah Thorne before she said a single word. This story was never really about Montana. It was about what we do with our pain. Gideon Sterling had 4 years of grief locked behind a brass padlock, and he called it loyalty. Hannah saw it for what it actually was, a man punishing himself for surviving. And she said so, plainly, because she respected him too much to let him keep doing it. Guilt isn't love. Guilt is a nail you keep driving into yourself and call it devotion. Real love, the kind worth crossing half a continent for, asks you to live. It asks you to open the window, let the air back in, and put the things you cherish on the shelf where they can be seen, not locked away in the dark. There's something else this story asks us to sit with. Knowledge protected these people. Not a gun, not money, not connections. A woman who had read her father's books, who understood what words on a page actually meant, stood in a smoke-filled room and proved that a powerful man had built his empire on a lie. 3 ranchers before her had lost everything because nobody told them what they held in their hands. That matters. It matters today as much as it mattered in 1887. The people who understand the rules are rarely the ones being robbed by them. And then there's Jasper, a man who had every reason to stay out of the storm, who rode into danger anyway, because the ranch needed him, and it was the right thing to do. No speech, no ceremony, just a wet coat, a cloth-wrapped parish register, and a look that said the reason was enough. That's the quietest kind of courage, the kind that doesn't wait to be called brave. Hannah never hated Higgins. She never hated Stone. She simply refused to become smaller because of either of them. That's the real value of her pendant. Not the stone itself, but the person who kept picking it up. Hold on to what's yours. Read what you sign. Ride through the storm when it matters. And never let anyone else's cruelty decide what you're worth. This story is for everyone who has ever had to start over with almost nothing, and did it anyway. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, and locations are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.